Good evening, buenas noches. On behalf of Mitchell Kaplan and everyone at Books and Books, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's Evening with Megha Majumdar. This event is presented in partnership with our friends at Miami Book Fair, Lit Hub, and Culture Crusaders. Megha Majumdar's novel, A Burning, is an extraordinary debut. Reviews have been fantastic across the board, and it's one of the most anticipated books of the summer. Tommy Orange says, A Burning is quietly beautiful and devastating. Its tone and pacing are measured perfectly. It is as funny as it is sad. This book won't let you go, and you won't want it to end. We couldn't agree more. Megha was born and raised in Kolkata, India. She moved to the United States to attend college at Harvard University, where she was a Traub Scholar, followed by graduate school in social anthropology at Johns Hopkins University. She works as an associate editor at Catapult and lives in New York City, from where she joins us tonight. To moderate tonight's conversation, we've tapped the wonderful Lauren Groff. Lauren is the New York Times bestselling author of the novels The Monsters of Templeton, Arcadia, Fates and Furies, and Florida, as well as a celebrated short story collection, Delectable Edible Birds. She graduated from Amherst College and has an MFA in fiction from the University of Wisconsin. We're so delighted to have you both with us this evening. I'll take a moment to remind you that you can purchase A Burning by hitting the button on the bottom of the screen, and that every purchase helps to support your independently owned bookstore, Books and Books. I've got a sign from the old bookshop behind me for good luck, so please keep supporting us. To start the program, Megha is going to read a bit from the book, then we'll bring Lauren to the stage for their conversation, and then we'll take some questions from the audience. So please feel free to ask them by using the Ask a Question button on the bottom of the screen. And now, without further ado, let's welcome Megha Majumdar.
Thank you so much, Christina. I'm not sure.
Not on the screen yet. Here we go. Here you come. Ha-ha.
Oh, there we go.
There you go.
Thank you, Christina. There's Lauren.
So welcome. Thank you.
Well, I guess I'll just complete what I was saying and say thank you so much to Christina and Mitchell and everyone at Books and Books for really being great early advocates for the book. And thank you, Lauren. I was just saying that I can't believe I get to chat with Lauren Groff, an icon, today. And I have loved Fates and Furies. It's a book that stays with me so powerfully, and this means so much. Thank you, Lauren.
Thank you. I'm so excited to talk to you. I can't wait. But are you going to read first, do you think? Or
sure, let's do that.
Okay.
I'll dive into a very brief reading from A Burning. You smell like smoke, my mother said to me. So I rubbed an oval of soap in my hair and poured a whole bucket of water on myself before a neighbor complained that I was wasting the morning supply. There was a curfew that day. On the main street, a police jeep would creep by every half hour. Daily wage laborers compelled to work would come home with arms raised to show they had no weapons. In bed, my wet hair spread on the pillow, I picked up my new phone, purchased with my own salary, screen guard still attached. On Facebook, there was only one conversation. These terrorists attacked the wrong neighborhood. The night before, I had been at the railway station, no more than a 15-minute walk from my house. I ought to have seen the men who stole up to the open windows and threw flaming torches into the halted train. But all I saw were carriages burning, their doors locked from the outside and dangerously hot. The fire spread to huts bordering the station, smoke filling the chests of those who lived there. More than 100 people died. The government promised compensation to the families of the dead, 80,000 rupees, which, well, the government promises many things. In a video to the dozen microphones thrust at his chin, the chief minister was saying, "Let the authorities investigate." Somebody had spliced this comment with a video of policemen scratching their heads. It made me laugh. I admired these strangers on Facebook who said anything they wanted to. They were not afraid of making jokes. Whether it was about the police or the ministers, they had their fun, and wasn't that freedom? Then in a video clip further down the page, a woman came forward, her hair flying, her nose running, her eyes red. She was standing on the sloping platform of our small railway station, and into the microphone she screamed, "There was a jeep full of policemen right there. Ask them why they stood around and watched while my husband burned." I shared that video. I added a caption. "Policemen paid by the government watched and did nothing while this innocent woman lost everything," I wrote. I laid the phone next to my head and I dozed. When I checked my phone next, there were only 2 likes. A half hour later, still 2 likes. Under my thumb, I watched post after post about the train attack earn 50 likes, 100 likes, 300 likes. Nobody liked my reply. And then in the small glowing screen, I wrote a foolish thing. I wrote a dangerous thing, a thing nobody like me should ever think, let alone write. Forgive me, Ma. If the police didn't help ordinary people like you and me, if the police watched them die, doesn't that mean, I wrote on Facebook, that the government is also a terrorist? I'll stop there.
Excellent. I love this book. This is, I read it in one sitting, the first time I read it. And then today also I read it in another one sitting. Before we begin, I'd like to do just a few quick things, if that's okay. One is to say, bless Books and Books. The independent bookstores that we know and love that are in our communities are so integral to our lives as writers and editors. And so if you're watching, and please, if you can, maybe buy a book. Especially buy A Burning. It's amazing. You're not going to regret it. It's beautiful inside and out. I love this cover too. Another thing is, if you have any questions, as Megha and I are talking, please do go into this little box at the bottom there and ask questions. There are almost no questions that are stupid. Some are, but not too many. So the questions that I am going to ask tonight, just to put it out on the page, I'm not going to ask Megha questions about her identity, because I find that often when you're asking, even the best intentioned Q&As sometimes go into a woman's identity or the identity of a person of color, when there's so much to talk about in terms of this incredible work of art. So I would like to just concentrate on this beautiful book and to talk about this book as it is in the world, even if Megha weren't sitting with us right now, which it's very exciting that she is. Okay, so the first question I have is a question I have because I have done probably, I don't know, a few hundred Q&As like this. And often when people describe your book to you, you're sitting in the hot seat thinking, wait a second, this is not my book. what is happening? So I would like to hear in your own words what your vision of this book is. What is A Burning? Did we freeze? Can you hear me? Hello?
Hang on. There we go.
Oh, there she is. Okay, good. All right.
I think I froze for a second, but now we're back. Okay.
Good.
So A Burning is about 3 people who are chasing big dreams while society makes this dangerous turn toward right-wing nationalism around them. And I just wanted to see how somebody holds on to big ambitions, holds on to their spirit, holds on to humor, when they are living of oppression, when they are living within systems that are discriminatory.
Beautiful. And I love that you situated it within a very political realm. I think a lot of times when we hear our books spoken of, they're not spoken of in political ways, but this is an incredibly political book in really interesting, subtle ways too. What I'd like to do is start maybe a little bit larger and sort of come in. So I get really, really excited about debut novels in particular, because I feel as though the writer is responding to all of the books in the writer's life that they have just loved, that have sort of changed their DNA as people in a certain way. And the first book is this sort of explosion outward into just it's a conversation that you are having, Megha, with other books that you have read in the past that you've loved. So my question for you is, what are the other books in the DNA of A Burning? What are the books that you are talking to or trying or reflecting or sort of playing with?
That is such a great question. Your question actually makes me think a lot about the journalism that this book has been very deeply nourished by. I think in many ways, this book came out of the accumulation of years of reading the news and watching what was happening in India, So when you think about things like an unreliable water supply, house being demolished, or you think about, a policeman injuring someone, these are all things that I think, or even the inciting thing of getting in trouble for saying something politically risky on Facebook, which one of the characters in this book does. I think all of that just came from following the news and seeing what was happening. So in a really fundamental way, journalism and good reporting has been key for this book's life. And then there are so many fiction writers that I have loved. I love writers like Jhumpa Lahiri, Arundhati Roy. I love this writer called Daniel Moinuddin, who is a Pakistani writer. He wrote this book of short stories that came out several years ago called In Other Rooms, Other Wonders. Yes. It's such a beautiful title, and it's such a rich book. And then I think about books like No Violet Bulawayo's book, We Need New Names, which is about these kids in Zimbabwe who are dreaming of a better life. And they are so skeptical and mischievous and just so full of life on the page. So I think reading fiction across subjects has helped me understand what kind of nuance and richness I want to have in my pages.
Wonderful. I was thinking as I was reading this, so there are, for those of you who haven't read it yet, there are three major characters in this book. There's Javan. Is that how you say your name? Is it Javan?
Jivan.
Sorry. There's okay. Lovely, who is actually possibly my favorite character in the last 5 years. I love Lovely so much. And there's PT Sir, which is also a very funny, wonderful kind of tongue-in-cheek name. And he's a gym teacher who becomes a functionary in the ruling party in government. And Jivan becomes a bit of a scapegoat. I mean, we heard her voice when Megha was reading it earlier. And so I was thinking as I was reading it this time about the figure of the scapegoat in sort of the larger literary history. And I was thinking of, Shirley Jackson, The Lottery. I was thinking of Sula. I was thinking of in the Brothers Karamazov, Dmitri. And there's actually a new book, Fernanda Melchior's Hurricane Season, and there's this really interesting character of the scapegoat in that also.
I've heard such good things about that book. I need to read it.
it blew my mind. It's so good. It's so amazing. I think everyone should read it. So I was thinking about the scapegoat, and then I found, just out of the universe suggesting it to me, this quote from Dostoevsky that says, "Imagine that you are creating a fabric of human destiny with the object of making men happy in the end, giving them peace and rest at last, but that it was essential and inevitable to torture to death only one tiny creature, that baby beating its breast with its fist, for instance, and to found that edifice on its unavenged tears. Would you consent to be the architect on those conditions?" And that's a lot of some of the philosophical underpinning of a burning, I feel like, is the question of what you would do to your fellow citizens in order to advance yourself. I mean, who would you make a scapegoat? So that's a very long question, I'm sorry, but can we talk about the figure of the scapegoat and the figure of what, how you envisioned this as you were writing the book?
That is such a beautiful question. And you're making me think about the tradition that you're placing this in, which I hadn't done until this moment. So that's really beautiful. I think for me, I was very interested in the question of what kind of narrative gets imposed upon certain people. So Jivan in this book is a woman who, all she wants is to rise to the middle class, and she wants to enjoy her new smartphone and keep her job at the mall. But because of certain incidents in her past, and because of certain aspects of her identity, it is possible for the state to impose this narrative upon her, where an act of violence gains a certain logic in her life, even though it's not a narrative that she agrees with. It's not a narrative that she would put forward about herself. And so I think there's a tension here between, who gets to star in their own story, who gets to tell their own story, and who gets to have the burden of this foreign narrative imposed upon them, and who has to live with that.
Mm-hmm. And who gets to resist that narrative in some ways, right? Because I think most people, at least within the book itself, kind of know that the evidence that the state promotes is very thin. It's very circumstantial. It's not real. And yet there's a clamoring for her head in some ways, right? So yeah, so her body, her actual physicality becomes a source of political battleground. It's a battleground. It's a really fascinating choice that you made there. I'm looking at the time, and I have like 500 questions, and I'm so excited to talk to you. Okay, so one of the things that struck me on the first read and this read also is that, and people say it a lot in all of your reviews, which are all just glowing, as they should be. The book is so speedy, right? It reads so quickly, and so you can just immerse yourself, and you're in it. And I know, from my own life as a writer, that it is impossible to do that unless you work really, really hard to make a book that immersive. So some of your craft decisions seem very, very clearly designed to make this book a very fast read, right? You have these short chapters. You have these sentences that are very beautifully constructed, but they don't really call attention to themselves. When there is detail, it is the absolute perfect detail, but it's, there's a minimal amount of extraneous scene setting or detail, right? You're just like, you're speedy. So talk to me about your conception of this book. Was that from the beginning something that you wanted to do, and you knew that you had to write it this way, or was this a product of years?
I think I knew from the beginning. I think a challenge that I set myself was I wanted to write a book that would be intellectually serious and say something about living during this time of extremism, but also a book that would be entertaining. I think that it takes real craft and skill to entertain someone, to give them a story where somebody can fall into it and have fun with it. That takes so much work. And I am so interested in that work. What feels stimulating and full of surprise and full of richness. I think those are all different ways of looking at what it means to make something swift and pacey and entertaining, right? And I guess I was also very interested in, TV shows, and I can't remember what I was watching at the time, probably stuff like Mad Men and shows like that. But, this idea that you have these shows where you are so invested in the story that you have to keep clicking next, or just like Netflix, let it play for you hours and hours, because you need to know what happens to this person. So I'm very interested in how these episodes open and close. And I tried to bring that swiftness and urgency to how I wrote the chapters. And I guess, the other part of this is that I really feel like a book is such an act of invitation. I am so conscious of how a book lays a claim upon someone's very scarce leisure time, and I wanted to make sure that it's a book where I can feel like every moment and every minute of someone's time that it claims is rewarded in a particular way. And that, of course, doesn't mean that you can't have different kinds of reward that I wanted for this book. And if I can turn this back on you for a second, you have you have written books that have been beloved. I was just looking at reviews of Fates and Furies to remind myself, and every single review was just like, this is a book of perfect sentences. And then I remembered that this was Barack Obama's favorite novel of the year. What craft elements in this book or in any others, maybe in the book that you are working on currently, what craft elements are you paying attention to, and what do you feel is still a craft challenge for you?
Oh, everything's a craft challenge for me. At this point, I've written 10 books, and I've only published 5. But you don't know what you're doing. I think that's part of the joy. But the craft element that makes me most excited is that of structure. I think that I just adore the physical structure of storytelling in books, and not just the physical structure, but also image, the way that image gets paralleled and changed throughout the course of the story, and the choice to set up a book the way that it is set up, which brings me back to your book, which is I love the structure of this book. It is braided. It's a plait, right? So there are 3 characters, 2 first-person characters, right? Jivan and Lovely, and their voices are very, very clear. And then there's a third-person character, this is a question I have for you. It's PT Sir, right? So we have these 2 very close first-person people, and then a third person, sort of Jhumpa-Lahiri-esque, because you mentioned her, like a very like cold and distant and beautiful. And then you have these interludes. And like for me, as a person who's just in love with the architecture of storytelling, the interludes were the moments where I was like, oh my God, this is the tent pole going through the book. These are so important because we sort of explode out of these 3 sensibilities and into the sense that this is a larger world where people are connected, but they're also sort of circling. And it was only in an interlude, the interlude on page 235, where my mind was blown, because that was the one where PT Sir has gone to give a talk to teachers in a school, and suddenly these Hindu nationalist people start to get very angry, and they go to wreak havoc. And I don't want to tell people in case they haven't read the book, but that was the moment when I was like, oh my gosh, the underpinning of this book, the political underpinning of this book has been here all along, but it hasn't really announced itself as loudly as it could have until fairly far along in the book. So my question is, in terms of structure, it's about the two first person and one third person, but also the very careful guarding of the beating heart of the sort of the violence against the characters coming out very, very late in the book. So can you talk about those two things? Because I found them so fascinating.
Oh my God, thank you for everything you brought to the book in your read. I mean, I'm just getting chills listening to you talk about what you saw in the book. This is such an honor, Lauren. Thank you. And I think, so I'll talk about the third person thing first, which is for Jeevan and Lovely, I felt like I needed the reader to stay very close to them. I actually tried writing in third person for a while, and it just rang false to me. But for PT Sir, I always felt like I needed the reader to have empathy for him, but also a little bit of critical distance to look at his moral choices and say, what is he doing? And what would I do in his place? And that felt right. He's also a little bit alienated from the other teachers, you know, and third person just felt right for showing him in that mold. For anybody who doesn't know this, they're just these short, very short chapters following minor characters for a couple pages. And I saw them as leaving these imaginative doors ajar. You know, I felt that I could only do justice to 3 arcs. I could only write these 3 arcs with any depth. But I wanted to gesture to the fact that there are so many such rich, complex stories that you can follow. And these are just 3. Yeah, so that's where the interludes came from. And the act of violence that you're referring to, I think it was very important to me that if I have violence in the book, it be absolutely necessary in a way. And I think I had to do the work of much of the book to get to a place where that would feel necessary, that would feel not just like an attempt to shock a reader, which it isn't, but an attempt to confront what we have kind of been talking about the whole time, and look at it in its most ugly guise. And I'm so glad you brought up the interludes also, because one of the things that I really loved in Fates and Furies, which I'm not the only one, everybody loved this, is the chorus that comes in, right? With these asides. What was your thinking on those choruses? Are you going to write choruses like that again?
It was only appropriate for that book because what I had thought that I was writing was an opera, right? I was writing an opera in book form, and I let myself go wild. And it just felt right because like the interludes in your book, to have something extra stitching a book together feels as though it is opening a door. Or, you know, when I teach endings in particular of short stories, I like to say, you know, an ending in any kind of narrative and any kind of story should be as though you're leading a reader into a room, or you've had them in the room the whole time, but suddenly the end is you open up a window that the reader didn't even know was there, right? And so I'm always looking to try to find those places in the text where those windows could be opened, maybe at the very end, or they're there in the text, but they need to open up and let fresh air, new light into the work that you thought that you were writing in some ways. So here, I'm so excited to ask this question because this is a question that strikes the very heart of why you and I do what we do. Okay. So when you were talking with Mitchell Kaplan, who is the incredible founder of Books and Books and Miami Book Fair. I love the man to death. You had this really wonderful point that in India, English is the colonizer's language, right? It's a language that has been imposed upon the populace. And the people who have English have privilege that people who don't have English do not have. And it confers on the speaker power in a really interesting way. And it made me think of, I don't know if you know the poet Kaveh Akbar. He's one of my favorite humans.
I know of him, yeah.
And he's a great writer, and he's just so brilliant. But he has this quote on Twitter, and he talks a lot in his poetry about using the language of the colonizers. And every day or every few days, he will retweet something, and he'll say, what does it mean to be a poet working in a language, a medium, a nation that can produce this? By saying that, by using English, right? This book, in this book, there's some just a really enormous political stakes, right? You've chosen to write in this language, and you've chosen to write about India, and I think that there's this power that you get out of that that is really kind of extraordinary. So can we talk about that?
Yeah. When I was a kid, I struggled to learn English. And I went to the first time that I applied to schools, I didn't get in anywhere because my English was so poor. And then I had to go get, additional English coaching. And so this idea that you have to learn English in order to succeed and move up in life, it was a lesson that I absorbed really early. And I think it's a very common lesson for kids in India to absorb. If you go to India, you'll see all of these businesses which are called like spoken English classes, where people go to improve their English so that they can get better jobs. So English is definitely a language that carries the baggage of having been the colonizer's language, and now, of course, being the language of the elite. And, one of the characters in the book, Lovely, she speaks in English, which is non-standard, and it is, it's an English that fits into the nooks and crannies of her life. It is not the English of, a child in the US or a child in the UK. It is completely hers. It's this marvelous kind of hybrid which holds aspiration in it. So it was important to me that even though I was writing this book in a kind of standard English, that I acknowledge the level of striving that goes into learning that English, and I wanted to have that reflected in Lovely's language.
It's wonderful. Oh, it's so good. I wish I could ask you 100 other questions, but I have 2 more, and then I have to open it up, unfortunately. The first one is, how are you doing putting out your first book in the middle of a pandemic? How are you feeling? Are you okay? What can we do to help?
I am okay. I definitely recognize that the book has received so much positive attention, and it has taken me by surprise, especially because it's coming at this time. And, I'm doing this strange balancing where I'm so proud of the book. I worked so hard on it. But at the same time, I recognize that, this is not really a moment that's about this book. It's a moment that's about people's lives and discrimination and a very long history and reckoning with it. So I'm kind of trying to hold both those truths in mind. I hope my book will have a life where people read it, but I also recognize that people are just thinking about huge things right now. But since you did bring up this moment and launching in this moment, I actually gathered a couple books by two of my Pub Month buddies. Can I shout them out?
Please, yes.
So I just got them today. One is Pizza Girl by Jean Fraser, and this came out earlier this month, and I've seen it described as a slacker novel. It's described here on the front as a sublime ode to obsessive outcasts and lovable screw-ups. So it sounds really fun. And the second one is The Margot Affair by Sanae Lemoine. And I've seen this one described as this really beautiful novel about a family. And I think it's set in Paris. And this also just came out, I think, a couple weeks ago, or maybe last week. So yeah, it's a tough time to launch your first book right now.
Oh, that's so nice of you. Are there other books? That was my other question, actually. Are there other books that have sort of taken the top of your head off?
Oh my God, yeah. So I'm reading this book called We Cast a Shadow by Morris Carlos.
I love it.
Yes.
So good, right? It's
It
so
is
amazing.
So good. It is so good.
Yeah.
And last night I stopped reading on this page 118, where can I just read like one line from it? The line that I paused on and that is still with me. It says, "History is backdrop. It is context. Anyone who peers into a canyon and finds something hateful in it is seeing their own reflection." This book is so good.
It's honestly, I cannot believe it didn't sort of explode the world when it came out. It came out like what, a year or two ago? Is that
I think
right?
so. Yeah.
It is so
It's
extraordinary.
really beautiful. And can I shout out another book that I felt the same way about? Did you read The Unpassing last year?
I actually have it right over there. Yes, I love it. It's so good. Yes,
it is so beautiful. Another book that I thought was maybe a tiny bit under the radar last year. It's up for a prize, I think. But it's by Chia Lin, and it's a novel about a Taiwanese immigrant family in Alaska who survived this tragedy. And it is such a gorgeous novel.
It's stunning and it's heartbreaking. Yes. No, I am on board with both of those books. Everyone should buy them. They're so good. All right. So we're going to get to the questions right now. Okay. Okay. So were you always set on the structure of the novel, the back and forth among the characters? Oops, I lost that one. Where did it go? Oh, yeah. If so, which of the three character sections did you write and then throw out the most for? Should I read it again?
So did I always have the structure of these three characters? I think I did have these three characters. It changed a lot, and I wish I could turn to my friend who I think is watching this, with whom I workshopped early drafts, my brilliant writer friend, Laura Preston, who helped me go through drafts and drafts of this. But I had these three characters. At some point, I had different documents for each of them, just so I could write each of them as a full story. And then stitching them back together was a lot of work. I had to find points where they could meet organically and not in too tidy a way. And I had to make sure once those arcs came together, that time moved in the same way through their stories, which I found quite a daunting task and spent a lot of time on.
That's great. This one is from Kat, and it says, Megha, you are able to give each of your characters such a distinct voice. Can you talk about how you develop their voices and linguistic affectations? Or are there any craft tricks or thoughts on character development that you could share?
I think about character development, I mean, I am learning, so we should really ask Lauren this.
No.
I will take this one first, and then we can pass it to Lauren. I think perhaps one thing that I've learned is I really like when a character is able to hold contradictions. My ambition with the book was always to write complex characters. I never wanted to write a flat villain or anything like that. And the way in which I tried to give them complexity is by allowing them to hold contradictions, right? So there are moments in which they are generous and selfless and do the right thing, and moments in which they make the most selfish choices and only care about themselves. You know, they are full of flaws as well as big dreams and aspirations. And so hopefully, I think a character is always kind of like a heightened version of a human, right? So letting them have those contradictions, I think, helped me.
Something I noticed in A Burning is that you have an almost Tolstoyan way of identifying a few physical characteristics, or one maybe, in particular with a character, and that sort of has almost a metaphorical weight, right? So, for instance, I would say I look at Lovely, and Lovely has this little tummy, and Lovely, the belly of Lovely kind of makes the character in a certain way, right? Um there's no vanity, but there's a lot of, just joviality in a certain way. It reminds me of, Steva, the character of Steva, right? So it's really interesting to me. That's something that you do really, really beautifully, and I wanted to talk about that. Something that just like a trick that is really fun to do is that if you really want to get into a character and it's a character different from you, this sounds so nutty, but I'm going to tell you anyway. You find a hat or like a necklace or like something that is not you at all. It's very much the character, and you put it on and then you talk to yourself. Charles Dickens used to do this. He used to look in a mirror with different hats on, and talk until he got his characters. And he's the king of the grotesque, right? He's the king of the wild characters who are themselves and nothing else. So
I love that.
it's a fun thing to do. You could try it. Why not, right? All right. Okay. Let's see. Sorry, there's so many. These are such good questions. Okay. So I wonder if you could talk about the construction of young girls as both full of potentially frightening power and terribly vulnerable. So they've got a ton of power and they're very vulnerable at the same time.
Oh, and I just see that this question is from Alex Hawley, who is a stunning writer herself. I think you're right. You're picking up on something that is so interesting, where in the terrain of this book, the character Jivan, who is rendered powerless in many ways, and she has to make choices where she gives up her agency, but she is still, there's a scene I'm thinking of that you just reminded me of, Alex, where she is arguing with a bureaucrat to get a water supply, and she's the only one who speaks up. And so I think there is something frightening about the way in which a young person like that will accept the system and will not accept that, you know, that is their place in life and that there is nowhere else that they can go, in the way that perhaps her mother has in this book. And so I think that refusal to accept that this is all you can have, that refusal, I think, is very frightening to a lot of people.
Yes. Yes. I mean, I was once a young girl, and, right? And there is this, well, in my own personal life, I can just transport myself back to the just walking down the street and feeling as an object of hostility, but also as an object of lust, and that really weird contradiction that happens within the physical body. And I think it's maybe grounding the character within the physical body is actually really, really important when it comes to writing about girls in particular. I mean, everyone, right? But you know, I'm going back to this idea, but the feeling of both vulnerability and power that comes bodily. That's a bodily feeling, I feel, and it's both imposed and external too. So there's like a tension point. where it's happening in both directions, I think. I'm trying to write down the names of the books that you wrote, and it's The Unpassing by Chia Lin and We Cast a Shadow by Maurice, what's his last name?
Ruffin? Yes. I can hold it up again.
Are you FFIN?
Yes.
I can't, sorry. Okay. There we go. It's there. All right, awesome. Okay, so what have we not done yet? Okay, ooh, what's your writing process? How long did it take to write this book? Did you outline? Did you keep track of 3 timelines? What kept you going in the hard times? Tell us everything. Amy J.
Hi, Amy. It took me about 4 years to write this. And my process was, I have had a full-time job the whole time. So it was really a lot of finding 15 minutes or sometimes 45 minutes before work in the mornings to write. And like I said, I kept 3 separate documents for each of the characters, and then I kind of stitched them together. I did think a lot about things like clarity when I eventually brought the documents all together. It was very important to me that a reader not encounter confusion or boredom. I think when I read manuscripts, I think those are often the 2 things that put someone off is you are confused, you don't understand what's happening, or you don't understand why you should care. You're suddenly getting a detail dump about someone, but you just think, well, why should I care? Why does this matter? So it was very important to me to have the opening pages make the stakes very clear. And of course, I'm saying this as if I succeeded, but it's up to the reader to decide if I succeeded. That's what I tried to do. So things like clarity, things like pace, really looking at each paragraph when I felt that the book had legs and I could examine it in that way to see how it contributed to each chapter. I wanted velocity in the book. That was really important to me. I didn't want big sections where the book really slowed down, even though there are so which linger in really beautiful ways. But for this book, I wanted each paragraph to move us forward, to give us some kind of motion, like either it moves forward or it takes you down into the character. So I wanted either kind of motion in every paragraph. Yeah, just stuff like that. And I think when it was hard, I think no one is waiting for my book. The world doesn't care if I write my book or not. It's up to me. And I have to reach into this place of inner discipline and just know that there's this book that I think I can write. And if I don't write it, then imagine the regret I have to live with. I would often tell myself that an unfinished novel is not a novel. So I had to finish it. But I really want to hear your answer to this, Lauren, and especially if your process has changed over the years.
Well, my process is it's wild and it's not very smart, and I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy. But my process is I get up really early. Right now I'm single parenting, so I get up at 4:30. And I can't. So I have anxiety issues. They're pretty major, and so if I start before my brain does, I'm able to actually work, and I'm able to get into a rhythm, and I'm able to get going. So I work as much as I can in the morning before I'm fully functioning as a human being. And I write only longhand, and I throw everything out between drafts. Most of the time that I write, I despair, right? It's all like, who knows if this is ever going to become something? And most of the time it does not. So my process is an embrace, a very like full-hearted, loving embrace of my own failure. And I'm a human being who fails like 99% of the time. All I do is fail. Like my children would agree with me every step of the way right now, right? But that's okay because that's my process, right? Like I'm okay with failing. So it's just a lot of like commitment to the one beating heart, the living thing in the work that I can see, right? And sometimes it's an image, sometimes it's a character, sometimes it's just an idea. And sometimes it takes 12 years and 100 drafts to get to the point where that living thing is spread into different realms. It's not just one living image, it becomes multiple living images or something. So it's really like being okay with just being a fucked up human being. Sorry for swearing. And, and, um, and knowing that eventually, if you just wake up enough days and get to work enough days, something will come out of it. And I know that sounds hopeless, but it's actually very hopeful. Because
I think that's hopeful.
I don't know. I don't know. I mean, yeah, I don't know. Megha, we could talk a little. I wish I were in person with you. We could cry.
I wish so too.
This is hi Laura. Laura Spensash is here. I love Laura. She's wonderful.
Hi,
Here's this
Laura.
question. One of the most poignant moments for Laura in the book was that Javon's parents are presented as one in their point of view sections. Can you talk a little bit about your decision to represent them in this way?
Yeah. You know, one of the most moving things for me is that point where you find that somewhere along the way, the roles have flipped and you have become your parents' guardian. And that moment where you realize that you want to protect them from suffering and you want to protect them from knowledge of your suffering, you know, because you would rather bear it alone than give them that worry. And so that was the relationship that I wanted to capture rather than two distinct relationships with a mother and a father. So it was kind of between Jivan and her parents as one. And so that's kind of why I wrote those sections that way. They're also not a huge part of the book, but I think where they do emerge, it is those moments of care and that I wanted to look.
Okay, I think we lost a sentence there, but I think we ended up with love, and that's good.
That's good.
There are only a few more questions that we can ask, so I'm going to see if it's. Here's one that's always very helpful, and if there are new writers out there, there's obviously at least one. What advice would you give to a new writer?
I think I would say to find what makes you angry and what you can't stop thinking about, and to write from that place. I think one of the starting points for this book for me was this place of high emotion. That is an important thing to protect, so that once you have that, you can then develop images and then develop scenes and narrative from that place, but you need that energy fueling your writing. So I guess that's for somebody who, you know, is perhaps thinking about a book project. And the other thing I would say is, for me, I have been indisciplined, and, you know, this is I'm able to listen to all the time. It is about showing up and cultivating that practice, even with no expectations and no idea of where you're going. Mm-hmm. What do you think, Lauren?
Word. So right. You're right. That's yes. I would like for you to give me a pep talk every day. Can you please do that, please? Thank you. Okay. I think we may only have time for only one more. I feel terrible about this. There's so many good questions here. Okay. I don't know. Do you want to pick one? I don't know which answer to do.
Scrolling through them.
I just don't want to ask any intrusive like life questions because we've fairly well succeeded in not doing that at this point.
Yeah.
Oh wait, that's a good one. For like not okay. Was there a guiding question or idea or multiple guiding questions and ideas that you asked yourself as you were writing? And Kat also says, your book is so propulsive that it felt like everything that you included was in service to a specific question or idea.
Thank you. I think I did have 3 questions driving the 3 characters. But I guess the big question driving the whole book was, how do you live in this moment of rising extremism with your hope intact, with your dreams intact, with your humor and jokes and spirit intact? So that was the question that I wanted to look at.
Yeah, how do you? I don't know. Yeah. Well, reading a book that's beautiful is one way, right? I mean, I think we go to literature to find the deeper humanity, to remind ourselves that there's so much extraordinary beauty in the world. I don't know about you, but right now I'm having a hard time thinking of what we do as important. But looking at other people's books makes me feel as though it's the most important thing, right? It's the whole asphodel, that greeny flower sort of idea where, I'm not going to get it right because I cannot quote, but nobody's died from lack of poetry, but we die from not reading poetry. I don't know, whatever. I wish I could look at it right now. But it's, it reaffirms the necessity to return and to pay more attention and to love more and to be more open and to let yourself be a human being. And I think that that's everything. I mean, I got that both times I read your book. And I'm so pleased that we got to do this. It was such a highlight.
Thank you so much, Lauren. Are you kidding? This is a dream for me. I still can't believe you actually read my book and then agreed to spend time chatting with me when you have a million obligations in addition to your own writing. Thank you so much.
Are you kidding me? It's allowing me to ignore my family. I'm so excited. It's wonderful.
And I want to thank you.
5 books from Books and Books.
Yay! I want to thank you so much. And yes, you really, you're both wonderful. Oh my God! And I loved how Megha kept throwing those questions back at you.
My chance to learn from Lauren.
What a wonderful conversation! Oh my gosh, there's so much great information in there. I don't know. I think you guys are on fire. So a lot of it, I think, has to do with the times that we're going through. People tend to become, really just spot on and more profound because you're thinking so deeply about so many of these questions. So I want to thank you both for joining us. Please order the book at Books and Books. We'll see you again soon. We have a lot of great events coming up. So please follow us on Crowdcast and tune in again. Thank you and have a great evening.
Thank you, Christina.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you so much, Lauren.
Thank you, Megha. Thank you.
Bye.